Do we need to push that OK button?
Welcome to another episode of the Homestead Guy podcast. Thank you for joining us. I always say we have a wonderful episode planned, and we do this time. Shawn and Beth Dougherty are with me here. They are from Ohio. They live on a piece of land that they call the Sow's Ear. They have some educational stuff that they do, and part of that is they call it the one cow revolution. So we're going to talk more about what all that means. Um, and I'll turn it over to you, Shawn and Beth. First of all, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate having you on.
It's a
Happy to be
pleasure.
here.
So just as an introduction, what did I leave out? What are you guys doing now? I've seen some, we've never met, we've never really talked in person. But I've seen a lot of your content online, and I'm just curious what you're all up to lately.
Well, so we've been doing this for about 40 years. So that's the not lately stuff, but that's what we've been doing. Most recently, lately, we have been
Rebuilding our
rebuilding our
house.
house. We had a house fire,
Mm.
and our children are doing all of the work, and they just put in floors yesterday and have been sealing them, and they look absolutely stunning. But the whole house, uh, what's been exciting about this rebuild of the house, we had a 100-year-old house that was pretty rough, and we would just change things as we could. But when we started on the rebuild of the house, our architect's son said, we need to be very intentional about making this a homestead house. So that how does the milk come into the house, and how does it move upstairs, and how does it do everything? And that's really what's been guiding it, is the functional. So although we've been homesteading on our land and on the convent up the road for a very long time, and I think we're getting pretty good at it. We're very excited about bringing that into the house. And I think as we extend our workshops and extend what we do, that being able to talk to people about what a homestead house can be, how you can think through that, I think will be another thing to add to what we do.
So that's a recent piece, and I would throw out there, just since this is intro, that when we got married, which was 39 years ago, almost 40 years ago, um, we set out to discover, and then we realized it was rediscover, the principles that have let humanity farm without inputs all the way up until very recently, the last few decades, and still do in a lot of parts of the world. And that was a long, fraught search, because the books weren't out there, and the people who could have told us were dead, our grandparents, our great grandparents. When we in the early 2000s, when we realized that we had sort of over 15 or so years stumbled into what's the paradigm, what is the pattern that lets humanity live in a place and use its nature, the nature of that place, not the nature of some imagined idea or the nature of some machine or input, the nature of the place, to make the place more abundant, more fertile, but on top of that, produce food for people. And when we felt like we had found that pattern, and we've seen no reason since 20 years ago to change our mind about that, we began teaching. So we come on to, we attempt, usually not by going on somebody's land, but if we do a consult, we do it from their land. Otherwise, what we teach, what we write about, and we have a new book series coming out with Chelsea Green on top of our own book, our first book, The Independent Farmstead, is how humanity comes to a place, any place, and interacts with the ecology of that place so that the ecology is enhanced and it produces people food. And what we mean by the ecology is enhanced is we're not radically changing it, we're simply helping it to become more self-fertile.
One of the things we've seen in commercial ag is that they move into a piece of property and begin a degrading process. So
Mm.
they are overcoming the
The
problems they're
nature.
creating
That's right.
by putting in petroleum chemicals and doing all that kind of stuff. But when they leave that property has been
It's a devastated zone.
right. It
Right.
has been the topsoil's gone, the soil's
The
dead.
hydrology is
Uh,
no longer functioning.
right. And what's very important to us is that when we leave this land, that our children have a piece of property that is immensely improved. Every year it's improved. And that's what we've been looking for and have found now a way of
Right.
doing that.
I would say, David, that the only reason you know who we are is that that message is compelling. Since we don't keep an online presence, since the only way our name gets around is in essence by word of mouth, people who hear what we have to say, oh, you need to hear this message. Um, there's really not much to know about us. That
Right.
it's that
It's the
pattern that's
message. Right.
interesting.
That's right.
Yeah. 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 And I forgot to say, you all speak at conferences all over the country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you've written that book, The Independent Farmstead.
Right.
Right.
And that's, I think, probably where I heard of you from, um, just different things. Other people have you don't do much for yourself online, but you have other people setting up classes that are online and
That's
Right.
true. That's
Right.
true.
what
We
is it?
don't object to other people's technology. We're just not any good at it ourselves.
Right, right. Well, I've learned a lot from you. I don't want to talk about myself too much, but you kind of have this story of where you think you've been, you're learning things. I mean, I read some of Joel Salatin's books. I read You Can Farm, and I was like, yep, that's it. I'm going to do that, and as soon as I can get enough land to just have a big farming operation,
Mhm.
and who knows, maybe. But when I've listened to your stuff, I'm learning a lot about what does it really look like. I mean, there's this sense that, like you said, throughout history, up until whenever, maybe 100 years ago or so, and to varying degrees, there's still places in the world where people are doing this. But people were farming and farming with very little inputs, like you just said. Um, could you just paint a picture of that for us? And not necessarily for like a market farm, right? You're not necessarily selling off a lot.
Right.
Maybe you're selling surplus or whatever it is. But could you paint a picture for us of what that looks like for you? And really, I mean, are you doing something that you've seen was happening in majority of households throughout history, where
We,
you live on a
we
farm
do
and
think that
you
it is
benefit from
something
it?
that the majority. We were just at a conference this last weekend, and one of the speakers said he ended up farming fairly similarly to the way that we do it because he had to, because he didn't have money. He didn't have, in order for us to be able to eat, he said, we had to do this stuff. And that's been our approach to it is how could one farm without cash, without the need, and what we discovered is that the farm ecology is not an ecology of cash. It's an ecology of sunlight and rainfall and using those things to power the farm. And Beth's particularly good at describing this story, so I want to
So
turn it over
so
to you.
think of it this way. Um, the planet isn't a planet of economic exchange. It's a planet of ecologies, right? And it runs on sunlight. That means that everything that lives, with exceptions that aren't important, tiny exceptions, everything that lives because somewhere a plant photosynthesized, right? And so all the plants photosynthesize and everything else in some way or other is downstream or upstream in a sense, is upcycling the plant material. Ecologies, neighborhoods, areas don't export or import. They just run on their own sunlight and rainfall, which is fine if you're a tree or a fungus or even a vole or a centipede. If you're a human being, though, you have a couple of needs. One, you never go dormant, and you like eating every day, probably several times a day. And to run a big brain and do the things we do, we need some pretty concentrated nutrients. So if you look at all the plant material, that's our one fund of energy for life is plant material. And if you look at it, about 90% of it, depending on what you're looking at, is the complex hydrocarbon cellulose. Now you're accustomed to digesting simpler hydrocarbons. They're still complex, but the simpler ones like sugar, which is short chain, and carbohydrate, which is a little longer chain. But cellulose is a funky molecule. And to digest it, you have to make an enzyme called cellulase. And guess what? Macrobiota don't. Big animals don't. It's bacteria and prokaryotes that do most of the digesting. They're the ones who produce cellulase. That's why a tree that falls in a forest will rot. That's why when you cut your grass, the grass clippings will rot because soil biota are breaking down that cellulose. Now let's reflect back. That's 90% of the biological energy available on the planet, the life energy available on the planet, can't be broken down and used by animals, not big ones. What do we do about that when that's our fund of energy? Well,
This is all that God gave to us. He gives it to us for free. We don't have to do anything to make it happen. You can't stop grass. It's going to come in. So, one of the things that we plant gardens and we do stuff like that, but we ignore this wonderful thing, this abundant thing that God gives us.
And the thing about grass is it's perennial. It's there all the time. It doesn't, grass has a growing season, but when it stops growing, it's still available for harvest. Like your apple tree is seasonal, and not only that, apples are seasonal. They don't hang around on the tree all year round waiting to be picked. But grass can be harvested in a climate like ours or yours multiple times a year. You can harvest grass and it will regrow. And since people have this habit of eating 365 days a year, several times a day, you need an energy source that can be harvested over and over again. The problem with cellulose is you can't digest it. So the good Lord in his wisdom created an animal type, a type of animal called a ruminant, which has a 4-chambered stomach, in the first chamber of which it hosts those bacteria, like the soil bacteria, that can break down cellulose. And ruminants include animals like elk, buffalo, wildebeest, and especially for human beings in most of the Western world, goats, sheep, and cows. When a homesteader comes to a piece of land, regardless of where he is, if he didn't buy a parking lot or something that was recently in a mudslide, he brought land that is probably growing grass. He might have bought all woods, but we'll leave him out for a minute. He bought land that's already producing a perennial, biodiverse, volunteer, self-elected to be here, sustainable crop. It's grass or it's weeds or it's briars or it's a mix of all three. And his only problem is he can't eat it. But the minute he brings a lactating ruminant on that's appropriate to what's growing, he can begin harvesting that cellulose as proteins, fats, and sugars that are abundant, that come twice a day, that are infinitely digestible by human beings. And since people might stop and say, yeah, but I don't want to live on milk, because we're leveraging our cellulose, that 90% of energy that was inaccessible to us, because we're leveraging that via ruminants who can digest it, we now have that energy that we can direct toward the other animals and projects we have on our farm. Skim milk is the classic, basic fallback food for pigs, for chickens. It's been fed to rabbits for many years. And even, oddly enough, it's a garden tonic, like the best plant antifungal that chemistry can make is no better than a dilute solution of milk and water. Plus, of course, the second leg under this, the second prop under this food system is that when ruminants are grazed in natural patterns, that is, heavy impact, long rest, and recovery, they build soil and they build fertility into the soil. So good grazing with ruminants actually reverses entropy. Entropy is that state, is that condition under which we think the universe is running down in energy. Things tend to go from a high energy state, high potential energy state to a low. But in a good grazing pattern, we reverse that because every good passive grazing builds more fertility into the soil, produces more grass that can feed more ruminants who can keep coming around and doing that. With, if you take a quick look at the 16 feet of topsoil that used to be in Iowa, no end in sight that we can think of.
And what we believe is that any these are strong statements, but any person who is interested in getting the best food that they can get will use these methods. And I would go even so far as to say any parent who's serious about their children growing up. We just had some guests here, and she said, I fed my child Cheerios. And she said, our grandfather or a grandfather figure to them says, every time you give those kids Cheerios, you might as well just be giving them
Glyphosate.
glyphosate or Roundup. That's what you're giving to them. You're giving them poison, and we really believe that. And if anybody's a serious parent that wants to have their children have the best food that there is, the only way to do that is to grow it yourself. You can't get it from nobody eats better than we do, and we wouldn't sell our food for anything.
Not
And
much of it anyway.
no, and I think that people need to get very serious about how bad commercial ag is. And you can buy organic, you can go to the farmer's market, you can do all of those things. You will still not get the food that you could grow yourself.
When we started, David, you referenced that we weren't talking about growing food for money. And it is a funny thing that modern people tend to measure the value of a thing or whether it's expertly done or not by whether doing it is generating a cash income for the person who's doing it. So if Caruso's voice teacher didn't charge him, we'd have to assume that Caruso's voice teacher was actually just an amateur who got lucky. But when it comes to food, stable foodways, stable food ecologies, agricultural ecologies in history have generally required that at least 50% of the people in the population be involved in agriculture. And that's not an idealistic thing. That's a statement about the kind of attention and care that has to go into our management of the impact of our tillage and our animals, so that thing I was talking about, how the soil gets deeper and more fertile with every pass, so that happens. Because the minute a human being or a human culture consents to take its food from the soil and deplete the soil in the same act, they have voted their progeny off the island. The minute we say it's okay for us to take our living, our daily food from soil that we are degrading, we have said that somewhere in the not too distant future, our descendants are going to starve.
And we are seeing the illnesses,
Yeah,
the sickness, all of the results, unintended consequences
that's right.
from farming this way. And until we start to decide that there is a better way, and there is absolutely a better way, and I think what makes us unique is that nobody else is quite saying what we're saying, but all that we're saying is what every farmer
That's right.
before 1900 knew.
Right.
You didn't find a farmer out there that didn't have a milk cow. They all had a milk cow.
Nobody was crazy enough to say, yes, I've got this almost unlimited energy source out there that comes to me just for the sake of managing it, but I'd rather not, right? I have this food source that would feed my family, top-notch food 12 months of the year, but I'll skip it.
And one of the things that we say, you're on how many acres? What are you on?
Acre and a half?
Acre and a half?
Yeah.
Yeah, people ask us all the time when we're at conferences and they say, well, how much acreage do you have to have? And we say, if we were in a suburban environment, if we somehow got trapped in a suburban environment, we would find a cow, we would hide it in our garage, and we would give it hay all the time because all of the good, and and we're not really being
Right. We're not really being facetious, except that we'd get caught.
right.
But in all other ways, we're dead serious.
But the things you would get from that animal, it would feed you, it would feed your livestock, and all the fertility that you would get. You would have the best garden that there could be. But even on an acre and a half, you could
You
have
could
that
probably
cow.
graze half time.
You could have that cow on grass from March
Yeah,
until,
yeah. Right. Down there in
oh
South
yeah,
Carolina, what you'd probably have to do would be fall, winter, spring, as opposed to our spring, summer, fall grazing,
Right.
because your dormant period is almost certainly in the middle of the summer. But at any rate, an acre and a half, depending on your rainfall, some things about your soil type, is actually adequate grazing for a small dairy cow for most of the year.
and you would put jet fuel on your farm.
Yeah.
And
So
that's what our experience was.
so now you're getting to really why I invited you on the podcast.
Oh, okay. Tell us.
Because so a little bit of a background. So before we moved to South Carolina, we went on vacation and we were staying in on a friend's Boy Scout retreat center, something like that. And down the street, their son and daughter had a had a cow. They had a Jersey cow. And so we milked the cow. We drank raw milk for the first time ever.
Fabulous.
And it blew our minds. I
Absolutely.
mean, it tasted so good and it
Yes.
was so fresh. And it literally, I feel the same way anytime I think about it. This was 10 years ago. And
Uh-huh.
ever since then, I've thought, I am going to have a cow someday. Now, again, I told you, oh, we're city folk back then. I mean,
Hmm.
really, I mean, we were on, 7,000 square foot lots in a neighborhood. I mean, we had chickens. I mean, we had four chickens in a backyard smaller than our house. So we were already starting to think about these things, but I said, I'm gonna have a cow. And then, Shawn, I saw you doing a little teaser for one of these video classes that you were doing. And you said, if all I had was a driveway to keep this cow on, I would get a cow and I would have a family cow on the property.
We're
And
Yeah.
so
dead
that's when
serious.
I thought, well, okay. I mean, I
Yeah.
have an
What are you
acre and a
waiting
half. Why
for?
not?
Right. Right.
That's right.
And I mean, I think I'm in the county. We have a rooster. He makes some noise. I haven't really looked at what I'm really going to get in trouble for. But talk to us more about that. So, what is the one cow revolution? What do you mean by that? Why should I get a cow today on my acre and a half?
Because it will not only, I mean, lots of things will change your life, right? Cutting your foot off would change your life, but not for the better.
Mhm.
Because keeping a dairy cow is the one base thing that if you do that, the cascade effects on your land, on your family's diet, on your family's health are it's the thing that you can't make all the other changes without. And once you make that change, once you have that dairy cow to take low quality, indigestible, cheap cellulose and turn
Free.
free while you're grazing and low cost if you are bringing in hay, um, and turn it into milk, meat, manure. The manure turns your soil into fertile soil that's going to produce the best, highest quality, plant material. You're going to eat vegetables, you're going to eat. And if you have chickens, you're going to feed skim milk to your chickens, and you're going to stop needing to feed them questionable crumbles, but that you don't know what's in them, because the protein in that milk will bring up the chickens' dietary protein to the 16% you need to get them to lay. If you have enough space and you can hide it from the neighbors, you're going to install a pig, because 3 days after you buy that dairy cow, you need a pig to help you deal with the volume of milk, especially the volume of things like skim milk and buttermilk that you're going to be producing. And so suddenly you've gone from a guy who buys his food
And
to a
your
guy who
feed.
buys a bale of hay a day, feeds it to his cow, uses the manure and the waste hay to build the best possible garden. I'm imagining you back on your 7,000 square foot lot with the cow hiding in the garage, right?
Yeah.
Best gardens in the neighborhood, pig hiding in the garage with the cow, consuming your spare calories from your kitchen, all of the waste plant parts from your garden, and all the skim
Your
milk.
children and you eating the best food that there is possible.
You remember that experience of trying that milk And I could see in your face and hear in your voice this experience that we have when we have like a really primal food experience where you're eating or drinking something and your whole body knows, I have never done this before, or there is nothing like this food experience where we really know with all of our senses, this is how I'm supposed to feed my body. And guess what? The more you grow your own food, and we're not kidding, it is that harvest of cellulose with a ruminant and its effect on the soil it's the starting point for producing a whole diet of food that does exactly that to you. Now we've been here 25 years or something. We have 8 kids. They've all grown up on this farm. They've all grown up eating what we raise. And it's not like going to Kroger where you're picking from 1,000 things. There's a limited number of things we raise. And honest to goodness, every time we sit down for a meal, this is 3 times a day, you see people just stopping in the act of chewing. It's like a moment of Thanksgiving because it's such an experience. The food is just so good.
And there is not another way to get there. The whole commercial ag system keeps tweaking the system and saying we're almost there, or if we change this, or if we start eating crickets, or if we do the variety of ways that they are trying to get to where we are is unbelievable. And all they have to do, all you have to do, all your listeners have to do is go back and get a dairy cow
Raise
and
a dairy
start.
cow on
And
grass.
people say to us when we've said this, they come to us at a next conference or a conference after that, and they say, we've got our dairy cow, and she is the sweetest animal. We love her. We love where we're going. We love what's happening. That happens to us all the time.
And I want to make the point, we are talking about an all grass dairy cow.
Yes.
The conference we went to last weekend, some lady came up to me and said, my neighbor says you cannot raise a dairy cow without grain. And we hear that all the time. My neighbor says you can't fatten a steer on without grain. You can't raise a dairy cow without grain. And it's easy to demonstrate to yourself that that's not a fact, in that the world is full of cows and other kinds of ruminants who eat 365 days of the year, and nature doesn't produce grain like that. So they can't actually require grain physiologically. Certainly, you could go to a commercial dairy and buy a cow that's been fed grain all her life and find that she does not transition well to all grass or all hay. But it's a fact that we are talking about ruminants doing what God intended them to do, which is convert cellulose, that stuff the rest of us can't use, but that they can turn into bioavailable proteins, fats, and sugars.
Yeah.
There was another point I wanted to make there.
Well, I'll say, why is it that people don't do this? Unfortunately, we are hopelessly connected to convenience. And having a milk cow and getting up at 5 a.m. to milk her every day, is not.
Shawn gets up at 4:30.
It's not convenient.
Right.
Growing your own food and waiting for it to grow in the garden is not necessarily convenient. Finding ways to store all of our food and canning and doing all of that is not necessarily convenient.
It's a blast. It's
Yes.
tons of fun. We have a great life.
Right.
Yeah.
But this is what people have to do, and people are not willing to do that. And I'm very happy. And again, I, you know, I am so happy that my children, when they grow up, and many of them are grown up, our oldest is 38,
38.
Can say to us, thank you for providing us with the best food that there is, as opposed to saying, Mom and Dad, you could have grown really, really good food, and what you chose to do was feed us poisonous food from Kroger's, from Walmart, from McDonald's. That's what you chose to feed us. And you didn't have to do that. And you chose to do that. And that may sound hard and harsh, but I think it's really true that we have an obligation as a parent to feed our children the best food that there is. And the food that is coming from our commercial ag system is poisonous.
That's just a
They don't
flat
have
fact.
they
It is.
don't have an option. You
Yeah.
cannot farm that many acres on that kind of scale and do it well. You
Right.
have to use weed killers. You have to use herbicides. You have to use those things. But when you're farming on the human scale, you don't. And you can grow the best food that there is on your acre and a half.
And we
Or
find
you
that
can't
people
raise
have,
that many cows or chickens without antibiotics,
That's
right?
right,
right.
exactly,
That's right.
just the
You
same
can't do
way.
it.
Everything you're saying really resonates with me. I think the reason my wife and I started eating healthier was because of our kids.
Of
It was
Right.
course,
probably
of
Absolutely.
10,
course.
12 years ago that we kind of the lights came on for us. And so it's been a learning curve ever since. But yeah, I'm like I said, I'm really looking forward to that time when we're using more of these things. We have a cow that's
Well, start
benefiting from
tomorrow.
using.
Go
Yeah,
find your cow.
go find
Stop
it.
mowing your yard.
We
Yeah,
do,
and I
yeah.
heard you say, whether you buy them in the morning or you buy them, depending on what time you buy them, it might be giving you food that same day that you buy it.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
We do
But
get that there are obstacles that people run into, and the two biggest ones, that categories of obstacle that I think people have, is one, they know they don't know what they're doing, and they are afraid because in a technological culture, if you don't know how to operate a backhoe, things will go wrong when you get in the driver's seat. But a backhoe doesn't try and help you. It doesn't have a an urge to live and an urge to reproduce, an urge to be nourished like an animal does. So people are intimidated first by the feeling that the learning curve is too steep, when in fact nature wants to help you figure this out. And I think people are also, and maybe this is the bigger obstacle, we are still afraid to swim upstream. We're afraid. It's like if your family home births or homeschools, when you start doing something that's countercultural, you know that the burden's on you. That everybody watching will blame any failure or apparent failure on you for not having had the good sense to follow the herd. And the same thing goes for homesteading. That when we say, I'm going to be different, my family, I mean, this is a whole family dedication thing. So when you move to the country and your kids start, you to pull them off the travel soccer team and they start working in the garden and they don't get socialized in the same ways, and maybe you homeschool. I think we have the fear. In fact, I know we have the fear because this is one that we hear from people a lot. How do I know this is going to turn out all right? How do I know it's going to be okay? How do I know that when I make this radical shift with my family, that the end of the story isn't going to be, what were you thinking? Why didn't you just go with the flow? But fortunately, the outcomes of the culture at this point are so bad
That's right.
that it's fairly easy to say, well, it's hard to do worse than they're doing, right? For example, looking at the commercial food world, it's a little bit difficult to see how anything you produced, any lifestyle you produced for your children, any diet you produced for your children, could be worse than the food waste they are presently inheriting.
right. Yeah. Now, what was your all's motivation for doing this in the first place? I mean, was it that health?
No,
Was that a big part of it, or how did
I
you get
think a
into
lot
it?
of what drove us along this path was that I had a full-time job. I was a teacher, I was a professor, and I wanted to be home more. So every dollar that went off the farm, or every dollar that went out, we were on a farm at the time, but every dollar that went out is a dollar that I had to earn. But what if we could start eliminating the dollarses? What if we could grow our own food? What if we could heat our house with wood? What if we could do, any number of things like that and just need cash less? I could work off farm less, or off off home less. And I think that's what drove us a lot.
Yeah, but so I think that skipped. You said
Okay, go ahead.
we wanted you home more, and that's the fact. But if you go all the way back to 1985, which was when we married, what we wanted was to be in the country, growing our own food and messing around with animals and gardens. We just wanted that. Wendell Berry says that the motivation for good farming is love. And that's really true. We just loved it. Our grandfathers were farmers. We spent a lot of our childhoods in the country. And we knew we wanted that thing. When I was 8, I read Little House in the Big Woods, and I was like, there's my life. I want to spend the rest of my life doing that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we grew up and went to school, and the whole culture and economy said, we can't do that anymore. Like, who are you kidding? And we loved it so much, we didn't care. We were willing to just keep trying. We weren't trying to make money at it. We knew we weren't. We had, the 1960s, 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then later 90s, etc., of farm failures to tell us that farming for money was not working for most people in this country. I mean, the farm population has crashed in those decades. So farming doesn't work for most people,
right,
for money.
And we were told that if you wanted to have a farm, the joke was that if I had $1 million, I'd just keep farming until it was all gone. And we thought, no, that doesn't work either.
Right.
There's a way to farm, there's a way to grow your food that is not expensive.
So Shawn said he wanted to be home, but he wanted to be home because we loved what we did at home. And there is a sense even in which we didn't say so much, there's a dollar for dollar exchange happening here, where the more we farm, the more he gets to stay home. Because in fact, for most homesteaders, it isn't true. They move to the country, they set up a homestead, and if they save a little on the grocery bill, they're already spending more than that on the feed bill and putting in fences and water lines and blah, 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 the things that they think need to go with having animals. So the struggle for us for that first, 20 years of our marriage, 15 years on this land, more or less, was to figure out what's wrong with the processes we're being told are the easy example is chickens. You go read a book about how to raise chickens for eggs, and it'll tell you how big to make your hen house and how many roosts to put in there, how many feet of roost and how many waters. And then they'll tell you, and then go buy Purina Gallina, 16%, and feed it to your chickens and collect eggs. Voila, you're raising chickens. And that was clearly wrong. The Lord did not invent chickens and Purina Gallina at the same time.
Yeah.
And we were looking for that thing that we loved to do that wasn't going to cost money. It was, in a sense, going to save money, but more, it was making us a different kind of people and a different kind of family. Shawn sometimes says to me, who we are is the product of this little wasteland hauler. When we bought it, I mean, it's still labeled by the state of Ohio. You can go to a plat map and it says not suitable for agriculture.
And we grow virtually everything that we eat and everything that our animals eat.
We buy luxuries. We buy chips and white sugar and flour, wheat, because we can grow it and we have grown it, but we choose not to grow it until we have to, or at least not grow it in bulk. We buy things that we could just as easily do without, but there's no reason not to eat chocolate as long as it's around, right? But if you, David, can't get chocolate, the result won't be you starve to death, right? It'll just be, oh yeah, I don't have chocolate.
Right.
Anyway, that was what we were after, is for us to be able to be a family together on the land, doing work that wasn't, there's nothing artificial about it. When you play soccer, it's fun, but you've made up a set of rules and they determine who wins and who loses and how you play the game. But when you set out to homestead without inputs, when you say, how does this ecology work and how do I get it to produce people food? There's an urgency. And one of the values of that urgency is that if you decided say you're a baseball fan, David, and you decide your whole family, we're going to be baseball fans and we're going to devote ourselves to baseball and we're going to be really good at it. At some point, some of your kids might say, I'm not really a baseball fan and I don't quite see the point. But there's no danger in a family that's producing its food that they won't see the point of food. They may at some point say, why this food? But they at least know the urgency of, well, we garden because that's how we eat, or we
Right.
we
And it
milk
makes
cows because
sense.
that's how
It's
we
not
eat.
right. It's not something that's like a hard sell. And speaking of
Right.
which, how do your kids, how have they latched onto this? I mean, are any of them still living with you on the farm? How do they, are they taking this and running with it as well?
Yeah, we have three that are still with us, and they farm with us all the time. The oldest five are now out and married. All of them have a relationship to farming. Some live on farms and are doing what we're doing. Others of them are
Three of them own their own homesteads.
right. One's in the
One,
Air Force and he's in Germany, so he can't.
but he's a veterinarian.
Right.
And then the other one actually assists on his in-laws' homestead where they run cows. But they're all in process of doing this thing, partly because none of us can stand to eat, to be deprived of the best food in the world. So when you know what it looks like and where it comes from, you'll go to some lengths to make sure you get it. So I will say this too, that it is a matter that they talk a lot about, that they feel very fortunate that this was their life. They feel like it's important to have it in their children's lives. Um, you know, Shawn and I began speaking because we thought, let's help people like David not spend 15 years trying to figure this out with their heads tied in a bag. Let's, like there's a few principles that'll get you 20 years ahead in 2 years if you know them. And our kids look at our teaching and they are 100% behind the forays we make into the public notice because they also think it's that important.
Good. Yeah. And so tell me a little bit more about the greater community too. I know you all have some cows, or you've used the land at the
Oh, yeah,
Franciscan
yeah.
convent
Mhm.
just down the road. Tell me about that. And do you have anything else like that where you have relationships with neighbors that you um, use their land?
Right. So our land was 17 acres, our original property, 17 acres, but almost all of it was trees upside of the hill. So it was very not usable. Very little of it was pasture, and we did have a dairy cow on it, and we knew that we would wanted to have more land. And buying land was not an option. We talked to everybody that was close. Nobody was selling. But we did approach the convent. We were going to daily mass there, and we approached the sisters and we said to them, "Would would you be interested in us, or could we take hay off to begin with?" And then follow that up with, "Would you mind if our cows actually were on your property?" They're a young order, mostly city girls, and I think there was a hesitation, a little bit of concern. But we
That was 15 years ago.
yeah, we started doing it, and it's been a wonderful relationship. We do an exchange of some food for the use of the land,
Use
and
of and care for, and they're very aware of that. And I think in any land exchange or land use exchange, um, it needs to be kept in mind that on the positive side of the ledger for the landowner is the land is improving.
Mhm.
Under mediocre care, it's going to be degrading, and the land is improving
and for many, many years, we were the only ones doing this. There were other
in
people
our
that talked
neighborhood.
about
Yeah.
doing it, and this would be the Toronto Steubenville area. I taught at Franciscan University, so we had a lot of colleagues up there. Some of them kind of interested in what we were doing, not
More skepticism
right.
than
And
anything.
some people doing a few chickens and stuff like that. In the last 2 or 3 years,
Five or
as
six at
as
this point.
homesteading has really exploded in the country, We are finding a number of people, many of them students from the university, returning to this area and homesteading.
I think our
Uh,
homestead list around here is like 30 little farms.
Wow.
When back in the day there were about three and we weren't very
and these are
connected.
people who are buying a cow and growing gardens and raising their own food, and it's been very exciting to be a part of what of
And
that.
in that community land use question, I would add this. So we're coming out of 2024, which is the worst drought in the history of this part of the country.
Hmm.
And we can attest that in the 35 years we've been here, we're definitely coming out of the worst dry spell we've seen. It's been hard on pastures, it's been hard on animals, it's been very hard on springs. And in order to stick to our dictum grass only, one of the ways we've managed to get around that is two landowners within, a short walk of here have given us permission to put our cows and graze across their land.
Hmm.
People see what care does, and they see, especially, there's nothing like just sticking around and being part of a community and putting into it to gain people's trust and tolerance. And so we belong to this community now, and people help us and make us welcome and are glad for us to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're running out of time.
Mhm.
But is there anything else that you think my listeners need to know? We've touched on a lot of things, but what's the nugget? If you're someone like me and you have an acre or 2 acres and you believe in all this stuff and you're just not there yet, what do I do? What do I do today? What do I do tomorrow?
One thing that I sign when we sign books, I always sign with farm with reckless abandon. Jump in. Don't hang on the edges. You just need to do this thing. Decide that it's good. We, you know, if one of the things that prevents a lot of people from jumping in is they are comfortable and they have enough money to buy the things that they think they need. And I think poverty is this wonderful thing that causes us to be serious about providing for ourselves. So I would say seek poverty, literally, and try and live on your farm, whatever your farm is, your acre and a half. Say, I am going to feed myself from my farm. And you will find that the first thing you have to do is get a ruminant on that property, put the John Deere away, and start learning how to do this. And if you, your listeners out there, have difficulties, you email us. And our email is shawnandbeth1960 @gmail.com. We answer lots and lots of emails from people asking what this country desperately needs. Million little family farms. It would transform our culture. It would transform our country. And we need to do that. We need to recognize this not as romantic or as that's a nice thing.
Escapism or fancy.
It's none of those things. It is what God said, this is how you are to live.
Yeah,
And it is, we know from our experience that it is the best thing that has happened to our family. And we really want other people to, to jump in. And again, because it would transform our country would be a totally different place if we did this. So it is self-seeking in some sense, for me to want this to happen.
sure.
And I
Yeah.
would add to everything Shawn says. Um, the pattern is simple and it's easy for somebody to describe it to you in short order. And taking that pattern and going out and interacting with soil and plants and animals is all it takes to teach you. When you commit yourself to that, there's one other thing you need, and that's you need to believe in it the way you believe 1 + 1 = 2. You need to believe that the patterns of nature work even more than you believe in the deceased zucchini at your feet, or the dead chicken, or the larger animal that is sick or died. You need to know in a living system, stuff lives, reproduces, dies, and is introduced back into the system. And you need to believe that pattern even when it's difficult. Most of the time, it's going to be jolly good and it'll be fine. It'll be work, it'll be messy, but it'll be fine. But every once in a while, you're going to slam up against realities like um, uh, pigs will die of mysterious things every once in a while. And when it happens to you, you have to not hang your head and say, I'm just a failure. I didn't grow up a farmer.
I
This will
don't have a
never
green
work.
thumb.
You need to just stay right in the game and say to yourself, stuff dies. You got livestock, you're going to have dead stock, all the different mantras that farmers say when things don't go right, and get right back in the ring and believe in it.
Yeah.
I when we go to conferences at the end of our talks, people say to us, "You gave me hope. What you said was exciting.
They
I
also
want to
say,
believe in this
they
thing."
also say, I was overthinking it.
Right.
I was overthinking it. And what you've told me suddenly makes me go, oh, there's not a bunch of mazes between me and my goal. This is a pretty direct route.
But I also think that the vast majority of those people go home and don't do this.
Right, they don't
And
do
I
it.
think that that's unfortunate because I think that we need to do this. We need to push ourselves to do
The
this.
time is now.
That's right. And not wait for some special thing
Sign
to
from
happen.
God.
No, the sign from God is creation. This
Yeah.
is how he created creation. And if we will step into it, you will find your food being transformed, your life being transformed, your relationship to God being transformed.
To
And
your family.
one of the
Yeah.
things that you will find is that you will never read the Bible the same way again because you will now understand, because so many of the references are agricultural.
Right.
And you will then understand why Jesus was led to his death like a lamb being led to the slaughter,
Making not a sound.
making not a sound. And you will say, oh my God, that is how a lamb goes to slaughter.
Yeah.
And there will be all kinds of things that will be awakened to you if you will take the jump.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. And
Yeah, yeah.
so you all heard it here. It's beautiful what you all were just describing. I hope my listeners take it to heart. And I hope we all continue on this journey. I know I am. I know everything that I say we've not arrived yet, but the things that we are doing just make sense. We do
We're
not
looking
regret
forward
it.
to hearing from
Anything
you, David,
Yeah,
that
we
we've
when
done
you've
so
got
far.
your
that's
dairy
right.
cow.
Email us
Okay.
next week when you have your dairy cow.
I'll email you, Shawn.
All right.
All right.
All right. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you all. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you so
Yes.
much.